Welcome to Current Situation, your weekly political pulse. I'm your host, Joshua Gale, alongside South Carolina State House Representative Jordan Pace. Every week, our goal is to help you navigate the complex world of politics through biblically conservative perspectives. Before we jump into today's conversation, we want to take a moment to thank our sponsor.
Beginning in 2023 and 2024, I am so proud to announce that Let Us Worship will be going to every single state capital across America. Just like we see Jesus tell the disciples to pray that thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, we believe this is the season to bring the kingdom to the capitals across America. Join with us over the next 2 years as we journey to see the fires of revival burn in every single U.S. capital. This is a monumental and ambitious dream that God has given us, and we cannot do it without you. Now is the time. Let us worship.
In this episode, we're discussing government education and the school choice bill. Jordan, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. How about you?
Good. A little bit less of a busy week at the State House, but a very important bill that's going up tomorrow. And a lot of friends of mine have questions about it. We're going to explain what it is not. Give a little history on the bill, the lawsuit that's going on in South Carolina, and then what folks can expect. And then, of course, as always, we're going to show what the Bible says about education.
So like I said, last week was the budget. It was pretty busy, and we'll come back around. We send that to the Senate. Senate will work on it in April, and then send it back to us. So this week we're taking up 5164 is the bill number. 5164. This was it's essentially an extension of a bill that we passed, that the House passed last year. The governor signed into law last year in the first part of session. That sets up what's an education savings account. In other states they call them vouchers, scholarships. There's a bunch of different words for it. School choice, education freedom, depends who you ask, the nomenclature, the names that are used. But the premise of the original bill was to set up this pilot program that allows scholarship fund to be created. And the first year, 5,000 families or students could apply for $6,000 to go toward a school essentially of their choice. And they basically kind of limited that the first couple of years with the intention of expanding it later. I thought later, when this was discussed, would be like 2 to 3 years from now. Nope, it's now. They introduced the kind of expanding of that right at the beginning of January. We heard, hey, we're going to go ahead and open this up, attempt to. So this bill expands that program and takes the lid off of the number of applicants for these scholarships, and eventually also takes off like the income caps too for families. The original bill, I think it was 200% of the poverty line.
Right.
And you had to make less than that in order to qualify for the scholarship. If we pass the bill tomorrow, it would take all those off eventually.
With a limit
on
how many scholarships were actually available. So about 5,000 scholarships were available.
Yep. So the first year, 24-25, is 5,000 scholarships. The next year is 10,000, 15,000 after that, and then none. It just opens it up.
Right.
And the year in 26-27, the income caps would be taken off as well. Okay. So no matter how much your family makes, you'd be able to apply for the $6,000. By that time, it'd actually be more than that. It'd be closer to 7,000 because it ramps up with the expectation of inflation every year. Right. And the money would follow that student to the school of their choice. There's a little bit of That's the good part. That's the really good part. The reason that's good.
Are there strings attached?
Well, there's also strings. But before we get to the strings, like, okay, why is this a good thing? Because there is an ongoing lawsuit, and we'll get to that in just a second as well. I ran on the premise of school choice. I went to government school my whole life, and just my
And by
family's
government school, you mean public school?
yeah.
We call it public school.
Right. I refer to it as government school because it's run by the government.
Right.
And my sister, I got a younger sister who was diagnosed dyslexic, really struggled in elementary school, all through elementary school, in the same government school that I went to. And especially back then, there was no extra, special programs. We weren't in the rural part of Spartanburg County. The schools really just couldn't help her. There was a private school, church school actually, that had more specialized programs that they thought they could help her figure the dyslexia thing out. So my dad, we didn't come from a whole lot. We never missed a meal, but we weren't, wealthy by any stretch of imagination. He actually sold his car to pay for her to go to school there for 2 years through middle school.
Wow.
They figured out her dyslexia thing, and then she came back to government school, and now she has a master's degree. So like I've personally seen what having options, in our family, like my dad had to walk to work for a while, but he made that sacrifice.
Right. And
I
I didn't know that about your sister, and I do know your sister. She's extremely intelligent. I've got a child that was diagnosed with dyslexia, and it's a hopeless feeling when you start to look into programming.
Yeah.
And you say, well, we're gonna classify it as this, and we're gonna put it in this program, and we just can't guarantee anything, and it's gonna look like this forever. No, so we started to look into that, and we ended up putting our children in a private school.
Yeah.
But it's a very hopeless feeling, and it stinks, and it there's a major cost associated, obviously.
Right.
So
the hope is by creating these scholarships, and it helps create a marketplace for education, because right now in South Carolina, the government effectively has a monopoly on all education unless you're wealthy enough to go pay for private school. Which there are now, thankfully, a little bit more options. With this in place, the what we've seen in other states that have put things in place like this, Florida, Iowa, Arizona, Texas, just started theirs. But the states that have had them for a while, like Florida in particular, Florida went from a very, very low rated education state. They put these in place. Theirs is better than this because it's actually universal, all encompassing. The money follows the kid no matter what. They've gone to like the top 5 in the country for education outcomes.
Wow. Competition's good.
Competition's good. And everything else. We have competition for all other aspects of the economy. Education is part of the economy. So that's the idea. When you have competition, you get specialized programs that are available, like for dyslexia or autism, or pick any number of things. It doesn't have to be a disability. It could be just interest, like arts-focused schools or math-focused schools or what have you. So that's really the idea. That's the good thing. Also gives options for parents who don't want their kids coming back as Romans.
Right. Which Jordan's referring to a Vodi Bakum quote: "If you send your children to Caesar to be educated, you should not be surprised when they come back as Romans."
Yeah, we've seen story after story about horrendous things, and I personally, I've received text messages and videos and stuff from parents and that have gotten from their kids in government schools, around the state, violence and like wildly inappropriate curriculum and things that the teachers have been saying that are totally contrary to a biblical worldview and a Christian worldview entirely. Right. So it gives those parents too a way to send their kids to a place that won't indoctrinate them in values that are contrary to their family's values. So across the board, it's just good for everybody.
Right.
Downsides, strengths. There are, in order to receive this $6,000, the school would have to qualify as an education service provider, is the term in the bill. Basically, they have to report the attendance of the students that receive the scholarships to the Department of Education in Columbia. And any scholarship students would also have to take the same state standardized tests as the government school of their grade level, and that their scores would be reported to the Department of Education as well, not for whether or not they get qualify for the scholarship the next year. Like that is written in the bill, like their test outcomes cannot affect whether they keep their scholarship fund money. They're simply used as a measuring stick is the goal. I personally didn't like that aspect. We tried to get that part out just because it's kind of weird and clunky. They kept it in. So those are two kind of strings that are attached to it, that if a school wants the money, they have to abide by these strings. Homeschoolers, on the other hand, we had a really good amendment put in during the committee process on this bill 5164 that exempts homeschool option 3, which is the vast majority of homeschoolers do option 3. They don't have to participate in those two strings about attendance and curriculum and test scores and those kind of things. They don't have to do any of that. All they got to do is submit their receipts. So whether they spent money on curriculum or whatever they spend it on for homeschooling, their costs, they can get back up to the same scholarship amount for homeschooling. So it's good for them too.
Right.
That if they want to participate, they don't have to. All of this is voluntary.
Right.
The other hurdle that goes along with this, there was a lawsuit where the court proceedings actually began on March 6th. Some teachers associations associated with teachers unions across the country filed a lawsuit against the original bill that we passed last year, claiming that it is unconstitutional. Within the state constitution, there's something called the Blaine Amendment. This was put in many, many states in the late 1800s all over the country. Specifically, it says that public tax dollars cannot go to private institutions, like private schools.
Right.
It was originally put in because the private Catholic schools at the time were educating recently freed black children. And the ruling elite of that time period was this, again, the late 1800s, did not like that because they couldn't control it.
Right.
So you can go back and look at the newspapers. I did some research on this. Like, they were very explicit on why they were shutting this down, and it was explicitly racist.
Wow.
So that's still in the state constitution. The House passed a resolution last year that I co-sponsored to remove the Blaine Amendment from the state constitution. Senator of the Senate, they haven't moved on it yet. But the lawsuit
you've got unions.
ongoing. Yep.
So usually more on the liberal side that are using something that was passed based on racism to objectify or to keep private institutions, to justify private institutions from not getting this public funding.
And that's kind of the irony is that a lot of the opponents of school choice claim like, oh, this is going to lead to segregation and they try to play like the race card on it, when in fact like the fastest growing demographic or minorities across the board are diving headfirst into these education freedom options in all the states that have passed things like this.
Right.
But there is a chance, not a small chance, that the court says, yeah, this violates the Blaine Amendment, so you can't do it this way. With that in mind, back in December, I filed a bill that rather than set up a savings account, the state would do a refundable tax credit. So similar ideas, about the same amount of money. That's if a family sends their kid to a school, they fill out a form. There's a version of this for special needs students that are already on the books since 2015, but only like 300 families have taken advantage of it, where the families get that money directly. So the downside of that, though, is you have to either pay the money up front to the school or work out some kind of payment plan with the school, because you wouldn't get that money back until you get your taxes back.
Right.
So like that's kind of the con of that system.
Right.
So just in case the court rules against us, rules against the ESA program, then that idea exists as a backstop to try it that way. So
Right.
we'll just kind of have to wait and see.
Yeah. And hopefully it does. It's classrooms are overcrowded,
Mm-hmm.
overcrowded in public schools, and students aren't getting the attention they deserve. And we are passing children that shouldn't be passed. We have the 12th lowest literacy rate in the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
We Teachers are overworked, underpaid. They're tired. They're exhausted. Um, the system is not set up for success.
Yeah.
And I don't care how committed you are as an educator.
Mm-hmm.
It is not built in your favor to serve the children, to serve the educators themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's heartbreaking.
The
Competition is good.
Yeah. The analogy I often give when asked about this is no matter how good of an engine you build, like if you're an educator, you're a really good educator, strong believer, like you're not doing all the weird, stuff you see on libs of TikTok or whatever.
Right.
If you're a really great engine and all they give you is Coca-Cola to run in the engine, then the system's broken. Like you can't.
Right.
That doesn't work. Inverse of that is true too. Like both sides have to work well, and when you only have one option, and that option's not set up for success, then it's a problem. So it's not. It's a system issue rather than an individual educator issue.
Right. And it really is, but it makes you think, that they're herding cattle.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some kind of indoctrination plan, there's just so much. And we know that the government is not great at running, extremely large programs and giving oversight to these things. And we see a lot of money wasted. And we're not going to get into charter schools and the money that's to be made from education, from,
Well,
and
it's a commodity. So I'm not even necessarily against money being made from it.
Right.
Because it's a service. That's the system we have now really is based on what the Prussians were doing, like the Germans back in the early 1900s.
Okay.
And the system that they built was to create good factory workers and good soldiers. Like that was the express purpose of the Prussian government school system.
Okay.
Because that's what their whole society was based on, industry and soldiery. So the John Dewey and like the founders of modern American government schools that are at Columbia University, which is kind of where all this kind of came from, went over there, studied that, and brought it back and said, we need to do this here because the government schools, the public schools, particularly in the Northeast at the time, were all run by Protestant churches. Like they use Protestant catechisms in the Bible to teach kids to read. Mm-hmm. Most of the private schools up north, the reason the private schools are Catholic schools is because the Catholics didn't want their kids to go to Protestant schools and get taught to be Protestants.
Right.
So when they brought that over, that's what kind of has flowed out for the last century of a school system that's built to make factory workers and soldiers, which is why they have like bell schedules and we walk in lines and you sit in rows all day doing the same thing. And it's just, we've seen an explosion in Montessori schools and charter schools and just other things because that's what we figured out for the last century is not everybody is meant to be a soldier or a factory worker. I mean,
there is the argument that this, when I heard some of this starting last year, that this only benefits wealthy families.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in Charleston, we do have some incredible, schools that are very, very, very expensive to attend.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
But we also have a lot of schools that are there to break even. You've got prep schools and academies that are not interested in making a profit. They're just breaking even, but they're there to provide great education because they saw a broken system. So this is not just to to benefit wealthy families, but for
No.
families that want a choice in how their children are being educated, which takes us to our next segment and our next portion. Jordan, is what does the Bible say
Hmm.
about raising your children, and the what is our role in that?
Yeah. So in Proverbs, there's a couple of verses to talk about. Proverbs 1:8, at the very beginning of the book of Proverbs. Let me pull it up so I can read it correctly. It says, "Hear, my son, take your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching." And then later in Proverbs 22:6, it gives the instruction to train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. And then in the New Testament, we get Paul reminding Timothy, "Hey, don't forget what your mother and your grandmother taught you about the ways of the Lord." Like every instance of education we see in Scripture is laid on the shoulders of family. Never, ever do we see government being responsible for education anywhere in the Bible. Even in the archaeology of like biblical time period, in Judea at the time, there were temple schools and rabbis and the Pharisees. Part of what the Pharisees did was run Torah schools for children, and even with the Romans, there weren't government schools. There were schools, but they weren't run by the government. After Christianity takes over and spreads throughout the Roman Empire, for the next millennium plus, it was the churches that ran education along with families, like in partnership with the families.
Right.
But ultimately, it was the responsibility of the family to teach their kids not only literacy, but also trades and finding them apprenticeships and things like that. It's really only the last century or so that we've, as a society, handed all of that over to government to be responsible for.
Wow. So extremely important. I think, I don't know where this was written, but a lot of Sunday schools were started to teach
Oh
Bible
yeah,
to orphans.
that is the origin of Sunday school in England. Before there were government schools, it was churches. I forget the fellow's name, and there was one guy in particular who felt a calling to teach kids that often were working in factories to help put bread on the table so that their families wouldn't starve, to teach them to read. And the only day they had off was Sunday. So before church, they would use the Bible to teach these kids how to read. And that spread all over England and spread over here to the United States after that. So that is the origin of widespread schooling. That's where the Puritans in New England started public schools, as we know them. The word public schools were started by them.
Wow.
Yeah,
And a lot of our universities and some of our Ivy League universities were all started as seminaries.
yeah, Harvard, Yale, many of the private schools or
Right.
Ivy Leagues
Right.
were started that way.
And then, we started to take more and more of the Bible out of school and out of education. And right now, I think Mark Driscoll says it, we have more people educated now than at any time in history in the world. And you wouldn't guess that because we have less wisdom. And education without wisdom is useless. And
That's what it says in Proverbs. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. So if you
Right.
take the fear of the Lord out of education, you remove the wisdom.
Right, right. And we'll see in this season, it's very highlighted. The fear of the Lord is extremely important to understand and to know and to keep. So if that's not something you've studied recently, that should be at the top of your list, understanding the fear of the Lord.
And the pushback on that I get from folks, from kind of the other side of the aisle is, well, this is because they'll straw man this and say, well,
Right.
do you want the government schools teaching the Bible? Like, well, not necessarily, because that's not what we're saying. What the point is, all education comes with a worldview.
Right.
Like that is inherent in education is whoever's teaching is sharing their worldview
Absolutely.
either explicitly or subtly, one
Right.
way or the other, in the curriculum, in the way that they teach it, uh, and that's going to come out through the education. I think that's Vodi Bakum's quote there. That's what he's getting at.
Right.
Is he's historically the Romans, when they would conquer a place, would take the children of the leaders, like the local leaders, bring them back to Rome and educate them to be Romans, and then send them back as the new rulers of those provinces.
Right.
So like their names would be familiar, they would be related to the local people, but they were really Romans. Like they inculcated, they taught their worldview, the Roman worldview, to them, and usually it worked. I mean, that's why they kept doing it. So all education comes with a worldview. It's either going to be biblical or not. I mean, that's the reality of it. And so that's why I think having a marketplace rather than a monopoly is better, because not everybody's a Christian in South Carolina. I hope one day they will be, and it's our job to get to share the gospel with them.
Right.
But that's not where we're at now. So as long as it's a monopoly, we're going to fight endlessly about whose worldview is dominant in that monopoly.
Absolutely. Well, and then we deserve a opportunity to keep some of the money that we put into this big giant pot.
Yeah.
And I'll remind folks that we're looking at salaries and we're looking at taxes. And Jordan reminded me the other day, that you can pay off your loan to the bank, but you still rent your house. You still pay property taxes every year.
And the majority of that property taxes goes to education.
Exactly. So you deserve a say in where this hard-earned money's going.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's really important for the future of your children to have a say on where they want to be educated and to be able to have access to the funding that you're putting into this pot at the end of the day. So, Jordan...
and I think this will create more options, because if there's entrepreneurs out there, if there's teachers who got out of teaching because the burdens outside of the classroom, the extra stuff was just too much.
Right.
But they still have a passion to teach.
Right.
If you know there's $6,000, $7,000 per student, you can go start a Montessori school, or you can go start whatever kind of school, style you're passionate about, and kind of like basically lay out a business plan to fund it based on that amount. That's basically what charter schools have done for the last 15 years.
Right.
So it can be done, and I think it will be done.
So tomorrow when the bill is at the House, you're pretty confident that the bill is going to pass, which then
all
has
indicators
to
look
make
like
it to
it's
the
going to
Senate.
pass. Mm-hmm.
Okay, once it's at the Senate,
if it passes the Senate, it would have to pass the Senate by the end of the year for the governor to sign it, because this is the second year of a 2-year session. So if it doesn't pass the Senate by the end of this session, then the whole clock resets next year.
Wow. So hopefully that's the case. Just to recap, if it's approved by the Senate and signed by, and then signed by the governor this year, 24-25, we have 5,000 scholarships available.
Double after that.
Which you have, that are applied for.
Right.
And there's prerequisites. There's things that are, income levels and disabilities, obviously, that get first access.
Preference.
Then it's doubled in 26-27.
Yep.
And then in 27-28, we're taking off the income.
Right. Taking off the income limits for families. They're still limited on the number of scholarships, but then after 27-28, the number of scholarships will be dependent on how much is
in the pot,
how much funding is dedicated in the budget that year.
Okay.
Yep. So basically, the first 2 to 3 years, they're trying to judge the demand. Like that's the idea of starting small. If it maxes out that 5,000, which I think it already has, actually, from what I've talked to the people administering it last week. They've already maxed that out. If they max out the 10,000, they max out the 15,000 after that, then that tells them, hey, this is huge demand. And I think there will be a huge demand well beyond 15,000.
Right.
It could be 185,000. Who knows?
Right.
But yeah.
So then that takes it where people begin to hold their state representatives accountable for how they're voting on these things to say, hey, if we're looking at the budget this year, let's see where we can reduce, and let's move some more money over here to this funding of school choice.
Yeah.
And that is the possibility.
And this bill is not the end-all be-all. Like, it still has some issues with the strings and some limitations. The providers. My goal with what I would love to see is that the $6,000-$7,000, whatever the average is, that the state allocates per student per year, for that to follow the kid wherever the kid goes, without the strings, with all this other stuff.
Right.
We're not there yet. This bill doesn't take us there, but it moves us measurably in the right direction.
Absolutely.
I think.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Jordan, thank you very much. And we'll know more next week on what happens with this bill here this week. Obviously, a lot of media outlets will be reporting on it tomorrow.
Oh, yeah. Very
as
much.
it finishes its time in the House. So then folks will be able to listen to this episode Thursday morning. We'll speak into that more, and then we've got more coming up for you next week on what's going on here in the state of South Carolina. So thank you for tuning in to Current Situation, and we'll see you again next week.